Hi everyone, in today's video I'm going to be unpacking some of the really important context and background information that you need to know if you're reading and studying Shirley Jackson's We've Always Lived in the Castle. I'm really going to try and provide a brief summary of some of these key ideas, and I'll put some links and resources in the notes below if you'd like to explore them in more depth. So first up, what was the world like in the time where this novella was written? Well, it was published in the early 60s in the US. This is a really interesting time in history. It's after World War II, you have the men coming home from war, and you have this massive boom in population. You also have a lot of people moving from the cities to the suburbs to raise their families. Now, this is before the radical movements, social movements in the 60s and 70s, particularly in terms of women's rights. It is a time where a lot of women were working while men were away at war, trying to keep the economy going. And there was a lot of social pressure on them at this time to leave the workforce and embrace their natural role, so it was called at the time, as wives and mothers. So this is quite a restrictive time for women. So how does this play out in the text? Well, we need to really understand this female and gender element to the text as we read it. We have two women living almost entirely alone. The rest of the family has been murdered, or in the case of Julian, has been significantly impacted, and the sisters enjoy their time alone to live autonomously, and we see these threats to that from the outside world, particularly male characters. We have Constance and Merricat, which can be read as two different sides of Jackson, and we'll explore this a little bit later. We have this notion, again, of killing patriarchy, both in terms of the rest of the family, particularly the heads of the family and the men, and also some of the male threats. In terms of symbolism, we also have some really interesting ideas around food and the home. And when we think about the home at this time in history, it was supposed to represent family and peace and harmony and love. And we have some of those ideas really flipped on their head in this text. Now, while they didn't believe in witchcraft in the 60s, it's really important to understand these witchcraft elements because they are evident in the text. Now, if we look at witchcraft throughout history across a whole range of different cultures, it is often associated with things that cannot be explained. Things like evil and illness and death and chaos. And it's particularly been used as an accusation against women. Particularly if we look at something like the Salem witch trials, we have a whole bunch of mostly women accused of witchcraft and suffering quite negatively as a result of that as well. Now, if we apply that to the text, we see in Merricat a character who uses magic as a means of having control and power in her life. She believes that through different objects and talismans that she can protect herself and her sister and her home, that she can harm others. She sees bad omens, she talks to her cat, and she has a lot of rules that really dictate the way that she lives her life. We can also then allow this to colour our interpretation of the villagers, who could be seen very much as a mob like that we saw in the Salem witch trials. Merricat can therefore be interpreted as a witch who escapes the fire and also the village mob. Now, I think what captures this really beautifully is this quote from the Course Hero Study Guide, which says, "The sisters survive their trial by fire, so to speak, and in so doing, they create a space for themselves in the world where they're able to live as they wish without the interference of Charles or society, which both represent patriarchy." So again, without understanding all of this context, you're going to be limited in terms of the interpretation that you can offer on this novella. Now let's have a closer look now at Jackson herself, because she has quite a tragic and interesting story. She was born 1916, middle class in San Fran, highly educated woman, and it was while working for her university's literary magazine that she met her husband. She and her husband lived and worked in New York City, and then, like a lot of other people at the time, they moved to a smaller town, in their case, Vermont, and you can see their house in the picture on the screen now. Now, Jackson was working, but she was working at home, She was writing at home as a wife and a mother as well. And while she wrote some incredible texts like The Lottery, many people know her for writing that text, a lot of her money, and a lot of indeed the family's money, was made by her writing cookbooks and housekeeping columns. Now, her husband was very controlling, he had affairs, and he really didn't respect his wife. So again, we have this really quite oppressive environment for her. Jackson developed agoraphobia, where she was quite literally unable to leave the home, and we see that mirrored in her character Constance. She develops obesity, very sadly a drug addiction, and she dies at age 48. So how do we see this in the text? Well, we see these sisters, this family living in this village that feels quite oppressive. The sisters do not fit in. They are a different class. They are very wealthy. Their house is very different to everyone else's. They do not fit in, and people are very suspicious of them because of what happened to the rest of the family. We also again return to this idea of female power. We have Merricat, who we don't really understand the reasons, but she has murdered her family, and she very much rejects gender stereotypes and roles. She's not who you would expect to see as a female in literature at the time. You can read Charles and society as representing patriarchy, and again, we explored that just before. And really interestingly, we can look at Merricat and Constance as representing the two different sides to Shirley Jackson. That Constance is this idyllic woman who is quite literally confined to the home. She is a maternal figure, she bakes, she cares for others, and she is very loving. Well, this can be seen as Shirley Jackson's public self, that the persona that she is trying to put on to really fit in to the times. And you then contrast that with Merricat, which is kind of this darker, more chaotic and instinctual character who is violent, who says what she thinks, and she very much subverts a lot of these stereotypes and expectations of the time. Now, the last thing we're going to touch on today is this notion that this is first and foremost a Gothic text. So what does that mean? Well, we see in our novella that there's this atmosphere of fear and suspense, and that the characters are very much under threat from others. We have a plot that is extremely dark, has supernatural elements, and is morally ambiguous. We know that the things that Merricat thinks and says and does are terrible, but we're also coloured by the fact that she is our narrator, and so there are different interpretations and ways to look at some of the things that happen. We also have very much that events of the past, namely the murder of the Blackwoods, that interferes on the plot because it happens before the novella begins. In our setting, it is very isolated, the mansion. The mansion is also haunted in that it contains all of these items that are very carefully preserved by the family. And yes, it's a castle, which often features in Gothic texts, but it is not literally a castle. It is only named so after the fire. In our characters, we very much have a cursed and haunted family in the Blackwoods. We have a very eccentric and disturbed protagonist in Merricat. We have a damsel in distress in Constance. And in Julian, we can see elements of both the scholar and the mad scientist. So these are some of those Gothic tropes and conventions. So where next? Like I said, this is just providing a really brief introduction to some of these ideas, but I'm hoping it's going to help you better understand the text that you're reading and also help you to develop some really interesting interpretations of the text as well. I would also encourage you to think about the contextual elements that may impact your interpretation. And that's the great thing about English, is that while all students may be presented with the same essay question or prompt, you are going to offer different interpretations. All right, thanks so much for your time, everyone. See you next time.